look up as I have this fish upside down and I'm planting a tag into an incision, and there's a 6-foot shark swimming directly at us.
Planet Earth, we can't neglect it. Nature sexy. We need these places, so please respect it.
Hey everyone, welcome to the season finale of season 2 of Wild and Unprotected, presented by Cape Class. I'm your host, Ethan Leaman, and today's guest is a really fun one. I have Zach Bell, who's the director of the Okinawa Kame Centre out in Japan and the Okinawa Prefecture. Is that correct? Awesome. Well, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me on, Ethan.
Yeah, excited for you to be here. I'm excited for this to be the end of the season. There's a lot of guests that we had. I was really excited about this when we went through our discovery call process, and I was really excited about how passionate you were about the species that you guys are working on conserving. So without further ado, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I grew up in Tennessee, and I went to school there, and I studied biology and health sciences as an undergraduate, and that's really where I was exposed to research. And so that sort of set me down the path of wanting to work in that career path. I moved to England for my PhD, also in biology, and studied mostly neurobiology, so how the brain is shaped by our experiences. And so I spent a lot of time focused in that area, and even that's how I ended up moving to Japan. I wanted to continue studying the brain in this area, and so there was an opportunity in Okinawa. So I moved here as a postdoc, which is sort of additional training after a PhD. And while I was here in Okinawa, there was an opportunity within the institute to start a company and sort of join an accelerator program. And so I made a lateral move within the institution, sort of leaving the postdoc behind in order to start a company, which had nothing to do with my training, I should say. It was in food technology, but it's really exciting. And it's sort of a way to potentially, fund my own research. That's sort of a big thing that you see in academics as well as conservation research. People live from one grant to another grant, right? So the idea was that what if I could make some money in an ethical way and generate some sort of income stream that I could then use to support my own research. And so we had some success. We didn't make a lot of money, but we were successful in the tech transfer side of things. That's how it was the hope of having a startup, was to make a difference and solve a real world problem in the market. And so we achieved that. And so we are still sort of waiting to make a lot of money off of that, hopefully, that we can put in. Sort of the timing of that tech transfer starting and being introduced, I should say, to a species of turtle that lives here happened about at the same time. And that's what I do now. I sort of work with a team to do turtle conservation here in Okinawa.
That's awesome, and it's kind of rare. You think about Japanese society as a whole, and I know we'll get to this a little later in the episode, but conservation really isn't at the top of the list. So going from starting a business and utilizing it to further your education to working in the conservation of turtles is kind of a wild twist. Let's talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, it really is. I kind of am using my sort of academic understanding of biology, or I should say academic research background combined with entrepreneurial skills to sort of tackle turtle conservation, because academics, you get really good at reading papers and designing experiments, and you really understand sort of how to do research and do it well, but you don't necessarily learn. That has nothing to do with running a conservation nonprofit, right? And I should
Hmm.
say with a tech startup, you really become, very skilled at developing good pitch decks, making websites really fast, delivering a message in a short, concise way. And so sort of combining that together is sort of, I think, given us, our team, really a strength in this area. But I had no interest in starting a nonprofit before. I had no interest in starting a company before I moved here. This is all very much accidental in many ways. I always loved animals and wanted to do conservation, but I was always sort of pushed away from, I'd say, my mentors to sort of focus more in basic science, biology, because there's more funding for it. And that's sort of the simplest way to put it. When you work on something that's fundamental in biology, you can tend to make an impact across all species, and including humans, which is where a lot of the funding comes from,
Hmm.
comes for the human side. Versus conservation, it's a harder sell, and it's harder to make a living off of it and or make a career out of it. So I really am I take off my hat to all the conservationists, because it's really hard. I know now that it is much harder than when I was an academic and when I was in a tech startup. And so conservation is not easy, and it really is coming down to the amount of funding that you can gain for this type of work.
Yeah, it really is. I deal with it daily, unfortunately. Wildscape is a nonprofit and it really comes down to the dollars and cents of all of it. And I tell people all the time who have interest in joining our team or getting into conservation themselves is the first question you have to ask yourself is, do you want to make money? If the answer is yes, then you're probably in the wrong field or you're looking to get into the wrong field. It's just not there. It's not non-existent, but it's very difficult. And there's a bunch of organizations that are fighting tooth and nail and essentially competing against each other to get that funding to be able to, work on the research or create content like us or be out in the field doing both at the same time, because that's a really big part of it now. So it's not talked about enough and should be talked about more because it shouldn't be this kind of hidden truth of conservation. Now, I'm glad you hit on the human side of things because there is a lot of funding there, especially government funding for human biology projects. It always seems like we're looking at what's the next way to improve. How do we get better, especially health wise? How do we understand our bodies more? And we completely ignore the animal side of it. So it's really cool to see someone who's been able to experience both and understands the difference in funding.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very unfortunate. Most of what we know about human biology and all of medicine has been derived from a small handful of organisms that can fit into your hand. In academics, science, when you work with animals, even working with microorganisms, you really learn to respect the organism, because it sort of reveals the secrets of life that you can then transfer upon not just humankind, but all animals. So it kind of brings you closer to the world the more you learn about the animals. But unfortunately, if you don't make that logical leap and sell the science that way, it's really hard to, this is why fundamental science, or we can say basic science, has so much more funding towards it. But I'd say there is a shift towards more translational work. When you do a project now, you really need to explain why this should be funded for whatever disease or for improving human health, versus before you could really study, why does a grasshopper jump really high? That sort of basic
Mhm.
science question, because a lot of the interesting science, curiosity-based science is typically what we call it, understanding those fundamental mechanisms behind, again, why a grasshopper jumps, how frogs communicate with each other, why birds sing. Understanding those things typically does lead to some translation to humans, but it's not always obvious. Versus now, there's a lot more push for you need to be very obvious from the beginning what you're going to do. And there's different types of funding, but I'd say that the larger, say in the United States, like the NIH, that's really coming towards better understanding of human biology for medical purposes
Mhm.
versus, again, curiosity-based science.
Yeah. Well, I, for one, am glad that you kind of came over to the animal side of things. That makes for interesting conversation. So tell me a little bit more about that transition kind of from the tech startup to your time now with the turtles.
Sure. I spent a lot of time outdoors and hiking and exploring, although I came to Okinawa for my job, as to work as a scientist, as a postdoc, and then I stayed for the tech startup. I really like living on a tropical island. So I should say subtropical island. It's not
Mhm.
tropical, but it doesn't really get cold here. It's really mild climate for the most part. It also doesn't get too hot. So just it's beautiful outside. So I spend a lot of time outdoors, and there's a handful of endangered species here. So just I would go out and look for that fish or that bird or that that whatever, that small little mammal. And there was a frog. I found the frog, but there was always this turtle that I could never find. And my partner and I spent, I can't tell you, maybe over a year looking for this turtle, and sort of off and on, not every day, right? But if we went for a hike or we went for a drive, we'd kind of look around for this turtle. And the more we dug into it, we realized that actually there's a reason why they're endangered. There's not a lot of them, and that's why it's so hard to
Mhm.
find. And we ended up sort of consulting with a local herpetologist who took us out into the field to look for these animals to sort of show us. And even when we went with him, we didn't find any. And that's really where the idea came from. Like, maybe we should consider working with this species. There's a lot of international interest, but domestically, it's just sort of slowly disappearing out of people's consciousness.
Yeah, I know we're going to talk about that international interest here in a moment, but let's talk about the species itself. What exactly is it?
So the species is the long English name is the ryukyu black-breasted leaf turtle. Ryukyu is sort of just the name because of the island. So there's a cluster of islands from the tip of southern Japan down to Taiwan that are called the Nansei Islands, I believe is the technical name, but a majority of them are the Ryukyu Islands. So it's just sort of different
Hmm.
naming system. So it comes from that. They're from these islands, and they're isolated to these islands. And they say black-breasted because the bottom of the plastron or the bottom of the shell is typically all black. There's some variation, but we can just call them leaf turtle. So ryukyu, black-breasted leaf turtle. So we'll just stick to leaf turtle. And leaf turtle is probably the easiest one to remember and the easiest one to say. And it's because they kind of look like leaves. And
Mm.
when they're on the forest floor, they camouflage themselves very well. But if you have an iPhone, that footprint, that's about the size of an iPhone, even the weight of your iPhone. So it's a very small animal.
Yeah, I was talking to my cousin about us recording this episode, and he had kind of laughed because I went through the naming convention, and he was like, "This might be the number one listen episode of Wild and Unprotected ever." And I was like, "I just told you a little bit about it. I mean, I think it's a cool species, but why?" And he was like, "You had me at breasted, man." I was like, I was all in. The moment you said breasted, I was like, "Oh my God."
Yeah, it's a weird one.
It's weird, but it's funny. Anything to get people curious, right? And that's why a lot of the episode titles for Wild and Unprotected are, borderline innuendo, borderline vulgar, and just fun. So anything to get people invested and interested. And that's definitely one of them. So, and to further that point, just like you had spoken about, comparing it to something that people know every day with an iPhone is another way you can get people interested because they can look at their phone and now more than likely anytime they look at their phone and they're like, that turtle, that's exactly what that is. There's an immediate relation right now. So those are two things that I think your research and work and the species have going for it already.
Absolutely. I mean, they're really small, especially people who think about, maybe they think in the United States, maybe a red-eared slider or some sort of water turtle. Most people would consider that a small turtle compared to maybe a sea turtle, but these guys are just so small. They really are. And the first time you see one, you're thinking, is it an adult? But it is. So it's part of the concern with them is that even if there was a dense population of them, which it doesn't appear to be, but even if there were, they're geographically so isolated and there's such a small area, even if
Hmm.
they reach their maximum capacity, there's just not enough space for them. And they're just not native to anywhere else in the world, but they are quite unique. It's related to the turtle is that they're red typically. That's a very common
Hmm.
color. So either the top of the shell might be red or the head will be red, the legs or tail. There's typically some component. There's variation, but that's another unique component. I don't know of any other turtles that have so much red on their body and their face. It's very unique.
I think the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are the only ones that I can think of. Raphael is about as red as a turtle gets anywhere else.
Well, then maybe that's what we should call them.
Yeah, the little Raffies, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, something like that. But it's kind of cool seeing your journey out to Okinawa and then finding this species that's native to Okinawa and the surrounding islands. And it only being there, and it's such a small, isolated area in comparison to where most other animal conservation takes place. It's really cool to see that.
Absolutely. I mean, it is there's just nothing like it out here. There's in Okinawa Island, it is the only native freshwater species. And although it's a freshwater species, it doesn't actually live in the water. It's just they sort of either say a sea turtle or a freshwater turtle. So it is technically a freshwater
Hmm.
turtle. It's not a tortoise, but it doesn't really spend much time in the water. Although I think it probably appreciates it from time to time.
Yeah, I'm sure for thermoregulation, things like that, and I'm sure that's really nice. Keep things kind of cool.
Yeah, the environment is quite unique in that although Okinawa is subtropical and it's warm and humid, once you go into the forest, really dense forest. So these guys prefer a really thick forest, more ancient, what they call a primary forest, or some of these forests that have been potentially chopped down but then regrown, what they call a secondary forest. Really
Hmm.
dark, very little light comes in, and so the eyes are actually sort of large. If you ever Google this turtle, they tend to have really larger eyes. It's thought that maybe this is part of an adaptation to living in this darker environment. But to the point, it's much cooler. The trees really keep the temperature down. And then even where they live, within sort of in and around and where they sort of live in, say, holes and crevices or sleep there. It's even cooler in those areas, which is another unique thing that is, for this turtle. They like it cooler compared to some turtles that typically want to stay maybe in a warmer area. They really do thrive in that sort of area. It still gets warm, but they do just fine on the coldest days in Okinawa. They can still be found, coming out a little bit and sort of walking around.
Yeah, it's such a different conversation than what we normally have on this show in regards to turtles. Most of the time, sea turtles, and we'll go through different species, and that never really pops up. For the most part, a sea turtle is a sea turtle. A lot of them live in the same kind of environmental conditions, and so it's cool to elevate that conversation in a different way.
Absolutely. I mean, I sort of described the English name as sort of, we just said the leaf turtle, but the Japanese name for these turtles is called yamagame, which means mountain turtle. And it is not just because they live in a mountainous region, it's because they can climb mountains. So these animals hang out on the edges of cliffs, climb on the side of dead trees. They're extreme climbers and appear to prefer a high vantage point so they can see. And when they're spotted in the forest, it's not uncommon to see them at eye level or looking up. So they're looking down at you while you're looking up at them. They really are these amazing climbers, and they're built for it. They have these large claws. They're really good at righting themselves, so meaning they can, if they're upside down, they can flip over quickly. And when you look at the shell of these animals, they tend to be, especially the aged ones, very badly damaged, and it's likely because of falling and rolling down mountains most of their lives. They look pretty rough and sort of weathered, and there's all these little holes, from damage. In some cases, it might be combat with other turtles of the same species, but they get these ticks all over them. And so the ticks will get into these holes and sort of dig them out. So you have this turtle that's climbing mountains with a long tail up in a cool mountain covered in ticks and holes all over it. I mean, it's very strange. And they're red. They're very unusual turtles. They're not just
It's
living
so
their best
cool.
life in a small stream or something, right?
Yeah, it sounds like if they're going through combat, then the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle monkey fits, but it sounds like they have a rough life in general. They go through a lot. And then on top of that, they're incredibly tiny in comparison to other turtle species.
Yeah, I mean, we're very curious, how long do they live? Because their life's so rough. There's estimates from captivity over 50 years at this point and still going. We're really well documented, but in the wild, we have no idea. Maybe they don't make it so long because life's so hard in the wild.
Oh, if they're falling off cliffs, I mean, I'm sure the death ratio is up there. Shell can only do so much.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't witnessed this myself, but one of our colleagues goes out and, we tend to walk at the low point and sort of look up, but he also walks sort of on the ridges and looks down. And he had mentioned that he would hear rocks falling, but then at some point he realized they weren't rocks; they were turtles. The turtles would just tuck in their shell and just roll down the valley into the middle because
Roll away!
yeah, it's the sort of their go-to move. It's quite funny. After you've spotted one, if you get anywhere near it and it thinks you've seen it, it immediately runs straight down, which is actually where you're standing, right? So they'll run straight towards you and you think they're charging you. They're really just going straight down because once they're down, there's always tends to be like a stream of water and they can hide in the water, hide under rocks. But it's down. That's the escape mechanism.
Yeah, that's a pretty wild one. I've never heard of an animal as their escape mechanism running towards most of the potential threats. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, most of the time they will kind of run at you. It's the path of least resistance. But there does seem to be they have like a protocol. And sometimes
Hmm.
if we have to use our license to capture and mark the animals, they'll go into an unusual place. So they might like run down a hill and then go into a hole, and you're thinking maybe they got lucky. But once we sort of take the measurements on the animal, put the animal in the same position, they do the same thing again. It appears that they know, like, if I'm caught, if somebody sees me here, run to this hole. They have it sort of mapped out. This is just observation, hasn't been tested
Yeah.
experimentally, but it does appear that they have a protocol for how to get away from potential predators like humans.
Yeah, get to the bunker.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, and once they find a hole, they really know how to wedge themselves in there. They'll sort of push their legs down, so they'll find a hole, push themselves up, so then when you pull them, they really are wedged, and they don't want to come out. And obviously, they can bite as well, and they hiss. That's another thing. Some turtles might sort of hiss a little bit when you pick them up, but these guys will hiss before you pick them up. I mean, just constantly hissing and running. So you can hear them as well. It's quite interesting without even touching them.
Wow. That kind of makes them kind of a special little turtle because it sounds like there's so many unique little features that this turtle has.
It is. I thought maybe I didn't know enough about turtles, so I started looking at other species, a lot of Asian species because where I live, and then, looking abroad in Europe, Africa, North America, South America. They do have a lot of features that I think are extremely unique in the turtle world that I think go underappreciated, mostly just because of the lack of knowledge about them and the lack of people seeing them in the wild.
Hmm. Yeah, well, it sounds like they attract a different type of interest as well in regards to smuggling as well. I know this is something that we had hinted at earlier on the show, and I think now is kind of a good time to talk about it. You have this really unique turtle. It sounds like it's a no-brainer that people would be interested in these turtles.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's all of their unique features unfortunately make them very desirable as a pet. And it's very unfortunate that they are captured because we don't know how many are actually there at this point. But when they are captured, there's so many islands that I think somebody who has a boat or something like this could probably easily smuggle them. I think the airlines and using planes, especially commercial planes, I think that's probably high risk. Even in recent
Hmm.
times, 2018, someone was captured in Hong Kong with 60 of these animals, if you can believe it or not, 60. And that's a whole little subpopulation or a whole population maybe in one area for that many
Hmm.
turtles. So yeah, they get smuggled into the pet trade, and sometimes the paperwork is manipulated in a way that makes them look like they were bred in captivity. And so they might be smuggled out of Japan into a nearby Asian country or city, where then the paperwork might be manipulated in a way that then they can be sort of sold to the international market. And so then people in North America and people in Europe buy these animals thinking, I'm buying this cool pet turtle that's from Japan, but it's okay because it's captive bred.
Mm.
But unfortunately, they're not captive bred. They are wild caught animals. And that's sort of become their new fate. And it's sort of this double edged sword. The more we promote them on podcasts like this to sort of help them, we equally popularize them and make people potentially want them more. And so when I'm talking to you right now, I have to hope that I'm doing more good than bad to help these animals because it's a tricky situation.
Yeah, it's always a double-edged sword when you bring eyes to a particular species or conservation effort because you never know how it's going to be handled. I think a really good example of this and something that really hits close to home to me is with whale sharks. Whale sharks are my favorite animal. It was the very first species that we had covered on this show. It's the very first species we ever did a documentary on here with Wildscape. That's my animal. And when you bring popularity to an animal, more people are interested in seeing the animal, especially in the wild. And there was something I wrestled with for a long time was people wanting to surf on whale sharks. So they would get on top of whale shark and physically stand on top of them while they were moving and record themselves doing it. And that wasn't a thing before they really became a popular species, talked about more. So I understand that wrestling of am I doing more good than bad? I would say the people that listen to this type of stuff, you're impacting in a positive way. But more often than not, you're doing something positive. So I try to think about it that way because there is that internal wrestling that occurs because you don't want to encourage people to get involved in a negative way or tip them off on potential locations or tip them off on something like, hey, this could be a venture for someone where it could be worth your while financially. Just as a CYA, no, this is not financially a good idea for anyone that gets involved. Don't go to Okinawa. Don't look for these turtles. Don't try to manipulate paperwork and don't try to sell them. It's not a good thing to do, especially you called it out. Pop numbers aren't really known in the wild to the extent like we had talked about, which also makes it kind of crazy that they're listed as endangered. So let's talk about that a little bit.
And so I should say I'm talking a little bit out of my field here. So I was trained as a laboratory science guy. So I'm not a conservationist and definitely not a conservation scientist, which I think those two can be separated out quite a bit. If we're talking about the protection of the animal and sort of how they're listed, Japan protects a lot of their sort of endemic species. And sometimes that's because of smuggling. But I think, and I don't know why, but I'd say in this case, and I'd say many animals cases, They do it just as a protection measure. They see it as this is an endemic animal, and this is a geographically isolated location. We should do something to protect these animals, and keyword protect here. And so for this particular turtle, they issued from two different ministries sort of a level of protection. So the first ministry, which is called the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology, which is quite a long name, but they registered the turtle as
Needs an acronym.
Yeah, it does. Actually, it's called MEXT, MEXT. They registered the turtle as a national natural monument, which sounds like really impressive to many foreigners. They're like, wow, Japan cares so much about this turtle. They call them a natural monument. It is nice, but there's like plants in my yard that are probably national monuments as well. There's so many things that are national monuments that are protected in Japan, especially in the islands, or the smaller islands of Japan. And then there's a second ministry, the Ministry of Environment, which they designated, or I should say, they registered the turtle as a domestic rare wild animal species. So there's sort of two levels of protection there. And then Japan has its own sort of red listing system, which they say these animals should be protected, not really conserved. We say it should be protected to some extent. And on their list, they title it as, or it's listed as being vulnerable, not necessarily endangered, but vulnerable. But then Okinawa has its own red list, which is sort of its own little island. And they designate it, I should say, not this island, but this whole prefecture, this small cluster of islands called Okinawa Prefecture. They designate it as an endangered species on their red list. So it goes from protection under two ministries by Japan, and then Japan as a whole says it's on our red list, but it's only vulnerable. And then Okinawa says, we're going to call it endangered. And then internationally, they're on the IUCN's red list, and there they're listed as endangered. And then in more recent years, they've been listed under CITES in Appendix 2, which is, I think, in hopes to cut down on sort of the international trade of the animal, because it just adds another level of complexity. So there are multiple groups that are sort of tackling this both domestically and internationally to sort of help protect the animal to some degree, but I'd say that the conservation in field work is just less at this point.
Yeah, one, you hit on so many great points. So for a lab scientist instead of a conservationist, I would say you did pretty damn good there. Kudos
Yeah.
to you. The most important thing that I think you called out was the imminent threat or thought there is danger for the species as a whole. Thinking about what's happened with the vaquita and how the vaquita out in Mexico, a tiny porpoise species, their population really declined before it got to that point. I think it's better to go about listing animals as vulnerable or endangered in that way to essentially give a call to action earlier. So you can get population counts, so you can get surveys done, you can learn more because of the funding that might come with that at an earlier stage. And then you can determine, okay, is this really a vulnerable animal? Is this endangered? Is this on the verge of extinction? What exactly is going on here? And see what you learn. So I appreciate, what the ministries have done for this animal. And I would say it's a good thing.
Yeah, I think so as well. I mean, it's part of I'd say the benefit of these ministries as well is that there's a law in place. And so if you're caught just touching the animal or trying to capture the animal or handle the animal at all, there's a steep fine, and there's also jail time that can go along with it. And so there's jail time or a fine. And I'm assuming that someone who just touched one or held it for a picture gets a less of a crime than someone who smuggled it. But even marketing online that you could sell this animal, not even in possession, just saying that you could sell it if you're caught, you still face, again, jail and fines. So there's some deterrence, at least domestically, don't touch the animal because it's too high risk.
Yeah. Well, now that we've kind of really gone through the smuggling and throwing them through pet trade, what is being done now by your organization for the species?
Sure. So as I mentioned, one of the problems is we don't know anything about the population in the wild other than, we'll say, really one study. And maybe even backing up further than that, the Ministry of the Environment, many of these government type jobs, these are people are on rotation, right? Maybe they'll spend 2 years in a position and then another 2 years, a new person comes into that position. And so over the years, there has been, I think, people who have had an interest in the turtle, but, they've kind of come and gone. And so they, as well as other local universities, they may go out and say capture a few animals and, get the permits from the ministry to, they're doing this all above board. And, there's different methods. There's the capture, mark, recapture method where you would go out and catch a certain number of animals, mark them, wait some period, and go out and catch another group of animals in the same area. And then based on how many you recatch and new ones, there are statistical ways to estimate a population size and density for that area. But those types of estimations have never been performed, mostly, I think, because people just didn't think to do them. In many cases, it's just, yeah, we looked in that village, we found 5. Or in this other village, we found 20. So there is one sort of long-running study that started in the year 2000. It's in June 2000, and this is sort of an important date because June 2000 was the same month and year that IUCN put them on the red list. And so it's been over 24 years since an assessment's been done on these animals. And you can think about that, almost a quarter century. It's a long time. And a lot has happened in that time. The one researcher who went into this is an individual. His name is Mr. Otani. We're all part of the same team now, so we're all working towards the same thing. But he was a local who worked at a zoo here. But he was sort of commissioned along with his colleague. Her name is Miss Toyama. They both sort of were commissioned with a local researcher to go out and sort of survey these animals for 2 years, 2000, or really 2000, 2002. Yep. And then in 2003, they sort of issued, here's what we found, here's how many animals we captured, here's the data. But then it was like, that's it, you're done. Well, they realized like, well, this isn't good enough. And so they've sort of made it their a personal endeavor or for their life to go out and collect the same data. And so they maintain their permits to still go out and collect data on these animals. And they've done so since the year 2000. So they have the best data set that exists. And, that's the same individual who took us out the first time to try to show us where these turtles are, where we had a sort of, a bad day. They have not been consistent in how often they go. So it started off maybe once a week, once a month, collecting data. But over time, there's personal responsibilities that come up, there's age. And so the amount of times they've went out there has decreased over time. And so we've tried to pick up where they've left off. And that's sort of one thing that our organization is doing, is working with those 2 original researchers to sort of continue on what they were doing, but equally start to evaluate and estimate the population and use that as a model to look at other parts of the island, because this is just one roughly 3-kilometer stretch of road. That's not Okinawa as a whole. That's one area. And it's not even, say, a natural area either. It was sort of, I believe it was selected because it was sort of a known hotspot to find the turtles, which is good for collecting data, right? You want to be able to catch your turtle to do your capture, mark, recapture study, and so you don't want to just pick a random place. So it's already sort of known hotspot. It's half of it is actually farmland, so it's actually not even a natural environment. So even us picking up on this capture, mark, recapture study, we don't even know how representative that data is. Is it a true random sample of the entire population, which is what we need? So using that as sort of a starting point and as a model for the methods, we're applying that to other regions in Okinawa and hoping to expand it to 2 nearby islands that also have small populations. And so that's sort of in the field side. In addition, we do a lot of education, teaching kids, teaching the public through whether it be photo exhibitions, online posting, any sort of communication event. We try to get out there and tell people about the turtles. And I think that's a big part of what we've evolved into. We started with the research, but really we've realized you really have to talk to kids and talk to the next generation to, because it's instilling that early on. I think that's most important. And then we still have added on traditional laboratory methods where we collect biological samples to understand. There's different techniques that you can use to estimate population size based on biological samples, the genomic sequencing component, which is a little more in the weeds, but both combining the sort of, say, traditional field stuff with the laboratory stuff with education, sort of the 3 main ways that we go at this. And at this point, it's only 3 or 4 of us. So it's not a large organization at all. And we don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's currently how we manage it.
That's awesome. One, I think lean and mean, is always a good foundation for a project like this. And tying it back to kind of what you said about really getting the information to the kids, have you ever thought about putting together a presentation for Game Freak or the Pokemon Company and seeing if they would be interested in modeling a future Pokemon after the leaf turtle?
I love the idea. Yeah, I mean, you actually, a few people have mentioned this idea of making, they've been described as a Pokemon. Because as soon as you start to say, oh, they're small, they have big eyes, the long red tail, they climb mountains, they're like, sounds like a Pokemon. That's something that we've become extremely passionate about, because we know once that gets into the consciousness of the kids, and not even just in Japan, but around the world, it really highlights like this was the Pokemon that was made after this special turtle that lives in Okinawa. Like that would be, dream come true for us.
One of the things that Pokemon does so well is the difference between males and females in game. I would think that this would be the absolute funniest way
Yes.
to have it done in game. For the listeners that don't know, everyone knows what a Pikachu is. I think if you say Pikachu, that's probably more popular than the Pokemon branding itself. Well, I'm a nerd and I'm just going to go ahead and nerd out here. The difference between a male Pikachu and a female Pikachu is the shape of its tail. The shape of a male Pikachu's tail is square, more rounded off at the top. It looks like a lightning bolt. A female Pikachu's tail is a heart shaped. Hearts are commonly associated with females, so that's how they determine the two. Zach, I want you to talk about the difference between, I can't even get through this. Tell us the difference between a male and female leaf turtle.
So with I think many turtle species, especially freshwater turtle species and tortoises, you see some sexual dimorphisms or sex differences between the males and the females. In many cases, it's the size, right? A male might be smaller and the female might be larger, just as an example. This is a species that, looking from the top, if they're sort of in their shell, you can't really tell the difference between the sexes. But once they start walking, the male will show you his tail. And if it's an adult male, it's sometimes almost twice as long as their back leg. I mean, it literally looks like a lizard or something. And the way the tail is used, part of the reason they're good at climbing is the males sort of tripod, because they kind of start climbing and then lean back and they'll use that almost like a finger to kind of push off things. So they sort of wag it left and right as they sort of run around, and they're sort of pushing off a rock, and kind of like some little tail spoiler thing. I don't know how to explain it, but
The
they
third
just,
leg.
yeah, it's the third leg, it's a little tripod. And that's one of the main things that we thought, well, maybe the females aren't as good at climbing, but we still find females in these sort of unusual, again, a tree falls down at a 45-degree angle. There's females still like to climb those trees as well. So it hasn't limited their abilities, but the males have an exaggerated tail. And across species of turtles, males tend to have a larger tail because it helps with copulation during breeding. But I would say these guys have a much longer tail than most males. So although the average, say, male tail, we'll just say it's a little, you can tell it's larger than the females, but in this species, it looks like a leg or something else. Like you're not sure what you're looking at. So, related.
I was going to say, for all the listeners that come here for the dirty stuff, because we do talk about the dirty stuff a lot, some hung turtles.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually interesting. I always thought it would make an interesting scientific book to look at the reproductive organs across turtle species. Because I don't know if it's not something maybe you should Google, but the reproductive organ of a male turtle is enormous for its body. I mean, like sometimes it looks like it's half their body length. It's insane. And so this longer tail, I assume use your imagination. But yeah.
I couldn't imagine. I'm thinking about it from my perspective, and I'm a typical dumb testosterone driven guy. I don't even think I would ever dream of what you would even do with that. Where does that even go? And why you got that? Now I understand why it's using it as a leg to climb some stuff.
Yeah, I mean it's both a multiple functions, right? I think the evolutionary biologists have a term. I think it's called an exaptation, where you have some adaptation for, say, one thing, but then there tends to be some selection for it for maybe another purpose. So the males, I'm theorizing here, so don't, this isn't scientific here. But the males probably have longer tails for breeding, right? I think we can agree to that. The male and the females tend to have shorter tails, which makes it easier for the male to breed with the female. But I think in this case, because of them living in these sort of forests and mountainous areas, that tail became an adaptation for climbing as well. And so although it might have evolved for breeding, I think there's some exaptation to its use in the natural environment. at least for the males.
Yeah,
Just an
there's
idea.
additional functionality, and that's it makes too much sense almost for it not to be true. I'm sure there's a lot of research and study that needs to go into kind of confirming that theory, but it almost makes, like I said, too much sense for it to be, all funny dick jokes aside, it's cool to see that kind of evolution, and additional adaptability for the turtle to use something like that. But it would make for a hell of a Pokemon, though, because could you imagine explaining that to a kid, the difference between a male and a female, and not as an adult just giggling?
I mean, it's even the few cartoons I've seen that has been drawn of the turtle. They tend to draw a male with a big long tail, and it's actually a funny point maybe to make here is that there's Okinawa post World War II was occupied by the United States Army,
Hmm.
Armed Forces, I believe the technical, and
Hmm.
only in 1972, I believe, the island was returned to Japan. So quite recent. So there's sort of an American history and culture here, as well as sort of a Japanese culture. And then there's also the Okinawan culture. But when it was American, they issued stamps. And in the American stamp, they have a male turtle with a big long tail. They're showing off that big red tail almost from the back, right?
That big old thing.
Yeah, I mean, America, right? Look at all that freedom.
Freedom and big old dicks.
But when it transferred over, when the island was returned to Japan, they also made a stamp, and it's a very cute, detailed, petite female. And so you can see the differences in culture, right? It's
Hmm.
more conservative and attention to detail versus this big male. You can't even barely tell it's a turtle with this long tail, but it's an interesting point of it was very obvious back then when it was American to draw this big thing.
Honestly, I mean, if that doesn't encapsulate male American culture in a stamp, I don't know really what does. I mean, even today, it's just a giant dick measuring contest out here.
It really does. One of the interesting things is that, we were touching on the smuggling issue and these animals going into the pet trade. Many of them were ending up in Germany, Austria, a lot of German speaking countries. So I was communicating with some of these German people. And one of them, I just flat out asked, I was like, what's up with German people? There's all these European countries. Why do you guys like this turtle so much? And the lady's response was perfect. She's like, he's bold and impressive, that big tail. I was just like, whoa, okay. I thought it was gonna be it's a small, cute turtle. It's like, no, that big red tail really had me. I'm like, big red tail or black breast, one or the other, I guess.
This turtle has it all. This is exactly why I was so excited to end the season on this, is because I knew at some point it was going to get to this point, and I'm so glad it did, because this is the type of stuff that makes our show Wild and Unprotected. We choose the entertaining route. It's, I guess, in this instance, balls
Wild
to
and
the wall.
unprotected, hopefully.
Yeah,
Need to reproduce
yeah,
more.
very. Yeah, exactly. Which, to people who have listened to the show, know that we have pushed the boundaries and have made every sexual innuendo in the book. The name is an innuendo in and of itself. It's meant to be fun. It's meant to grab your attention. And this species clearly does it. Another thing that you spoke on, which I thought was a really good transition point, was the difference in culture between the United States and Japan. Let's talk about conservation in Japan and how the culture has impacted it and where conservation is going now.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a great point to talk about. Only recently, I mean, within the past month or so, I was in communication, on another podcast where the two gentlemen I was communicating with, both of them had worked as conservationists. One had actually worked in the government. So they're very well versed maybe on the sort of historical side. Put something into words that, I had not been able to verbalize. And that was my understanding of conservation and protection and the differences between Japan and the United States. And so Japan, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of rules. You can't touch the animal, you can't handle the animal. This area is protected by multiple ministries. There's these lists. And so there's this sort of protectionist approach. We're not going to manage the animal, we're not going to touch the animal, because if we tell people don't touch them, people shouldn't touch them. And I'd say in a country like Japan, people follow the rules. I mean, it's very different than the United States. There's almost like there's this sort of cool macho-ness or something to breaking the rules and breaking laws that doesn't exist here. You're not going to get extra points. And so by making those rules, they sort of protected the animals, but they haven't necessarily conserve them. And what I was taught is that conservation is more about the active management of land and animals, right? Going in, it's not saying that we're not going to touch it. It's we might have to go in and take out some animals for the pet trade. We might have to go out and cut some trees, but we're going to manage it. We're going to plant new trees. We're going to monitor the wild populations. And so there's a lot more, you're more integrated into the wildlife and the nature with the conservationist approach. And Japan doesn't have that to a major extent, to my knowledge. It's definitely more on the preservation side where it is don't touch it. And I was told that the United States is much better at conservation than protection. And I believe that both are in place. And I believe protectionism sort of came on board first and then conservation. But I believe over time, conservation has proven to be the more effective strategy for just the maintenance of natural resources and the better approach to making sure these animals are alive in the next generation. As humans sort of encroach upon their habitat, because one of the major threats to these animals, we've touched on smuggling, but I think the major problem, that's maybe not easily avoidable, but it's just land development here. This is an island nation, and most of the people come here for tourism, or it's a farming community. So people grow a lot of crops here, or they're building things for tourists to come here. And so there's constant land development, and these are economic drivers here. Those are the two main ones. So you're not going to, if you bulldoze, a small forest and put a resort there, wow, we created jobs. My family can eat now. Or you bulldozed a forest and now we can plant food. So now we can sell that. We can make money. People can eat. That's the real struggle, and sort of the protectionist approach doesn't really help in that case. Versus if you were doing more conservation, you would say, well, let's go evaluate that land really thoroughly and check, is this a good place? Maybe we should go over here. And to my knowledge, and I should say one of our directors of our organization now, he used to have that job to some extent, but I don't know if it wasn't clear, are there animals here that need protection? Yes or no? I think that might have just been a tick box. I don't know that it actually made a difference of what they did. It was just maybe they knew what they were doing when they did it instead of just not knowing. But I'm not sure. But Japan really does take this protectionistic approach, if that's a word, to this problem. And maybe on mainland Japan, it's very useful. But in Okinawa, it's such a small area, especially these other islands, that we need conservation here. We need to know the animals, because this is just one of many animals. And protecting the forest is great because there are areas that are sort of protected. Even in the past few years, one of our forests became a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which is really great. That they're going to protect all those animals with protecting that land. And I think that's probably been shown to be a highly effective way to help animals. But I still think that the conservation aspect should be done in parallel. And that's something that Japan is just has, I think, less historical roles in, at least in the islands where I live. It might not be true for the rest of Japan.
Yeah, I think Japan, from an outsider's perspective, is a country that lives both in the future and the past at the same time. And this is one of those instances where Japan seems to live in the past, especially in regards to the protection versus conservation. It works for the United States because most people, I think, within the United States have the mentality of, rules are meant to be broken, kind of like you hit on. And if you put a rule in place, that more than likely encourages the rule to be broken. I think the only time that rules like that from a protection standpoint are built into place are never for the animals themselves. It's more for the humans. Thinking about grizzly bear conservation, and rules are in place and protections are in place more for the dumbass humans, more so than the grizzly bear itself. Don't go touch that grizzly bear. You can get your ass kicked. The conservations are put in place and they're more effective, I think, from the human standpoint and psychological standpoint, because you're able to garner more interest. People can get involved. A lot of people, especially in the States, and I think all over the world, like to kind of get their hands dirty and feel like they're a part of something. Where that rule-driven approach is more, here's the line, don't step over the line. We know why the line is here, don't do it, please. And that's that. And you can see that there's been leaps and bounds in growth in conservation because of people getting involved, getting their hands dirty, being able to interact with the animals, more data. more research is allowed to be done. There's less red tape around it. When there's a protectionist point of view that says don't touch the animal, what's the only way you get to touch the animal? Through permitting. What takes forever and makes it very difficult? Permitting. So that was one of the things that popped into my mind when we had first spoke about this, was so far into the future in regards to technology, but when it comes to our planet itself, so far behind. And it's nice to see people like you really pushing on those boundaries to say, hey, we need to scoot this along if we want to get up to kind of standards that are in other places.
Yep. I think one of the main issues that I don't think there was ever the competition, right? I think in the U.S. because there was both the conservation and preservation approaches, and there was competition for the two and one won out. I just don't think that it's been presented in a way, or it's been evaluated uh, to the same extent, because
Yeah.
again, it's such a homogenous population, and people do good for the community, right? The United States is so heterogeneous that I don't even know who your neighbor is, versus here everybody's either Okinawan or Japanese, right? There's sort of this we're all one unit type thing, versus America.
Hmm.
And so I think from the protection side of things, if you say don't break the rule, well, if you don't break the rule, I won't break the rule, right? If everybody plays by these
Hmm.
rules, and it's a Japanese turtle, or we say Okinawan, or part of these islands, it's all of our turtle. Versus in the United
Hmm.
States, there's so many people coming in and out. I think the protection has failed. And I'll give maybe two examples. Is, say you protect the forest. What happens if there's a disease and it spreads to all the turtles and they all die, right? You won't know because you're not monitoring them, right? And
Hmm.
one of the things that our Mr. Otani and Ms. Toyama, the two individuals that work with us now, Mr. Otani being one of our directors, their field study from the year 2000, although they haven't went out as recently, when you look at the numbers of recaptures and the amount of animals they've had, and you sort of control for the inconsistency in going out, there's steady decline in the amount of animals. And so if it wasn't for that, maybe we wouldn't know, other than the anecdotes from locals who say, yeah, we used to see turtles, we don't see them as often. Well, we don't know what that means, right? Is that because there's more development, or is it because there's less turtles that are, because there's less turtles? And I'd say their work, Mr. Toriyama and Mr. Otani, going out and sort of showing that they're just not catching as many new turtles over time and seeing less babies over time. That's real conservation for me. You're really getting in there,
Hmm.
and you can develop some sort of strategy, at least to understand what the threat is, and to try to mitigate the threat, whether you go in and do some other intervention. But I think just being able to identify what are the true threats, and to be able to sort of rank them, right? Okay, roads are bad, cutting up the land's bad, smuggling's bad, but which one's actually doing the most harm? You don't know that
Hmm.
by just saying don't touch the animals. You really have to get in there and sort of track populations in different areas with different environments to sort of start to evaluate what is really going on. But I think Japan's going to come along to it. I think it's just there's just many cultural differences and historical differences.
Yeah, well, with individuals like you and your organization, I think it's a matter of time, really, before that conversion happens and you see a lot more conservation over true protection. Well, I think that is a good point for us to go to the favorite segment of the show. We're gonna move into the wild stories segment of the show. For our listeners out there, the wild stories segment is where we have our conservation friends and partners let loose, have some fun. We've already had a lot of fun on this show already. At least I know I have. So, Zach, do you have any wild stories for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have maybe a few we can discuss. I'd say the first one is really just about what it's like being in the forest. And I think maybe other conservationists, I say others as if I'm one of them, conservationists could relate to
You
this,
are, you
whatever I
are,
am.
you are.
You always have to time things, right? It's like we're going to go to the forest. Well, we can't just go out every day and hope we find animals to sort of capture and sort of take some body measurements, because we're trying to keep track of these animals in the wild, right? But you can't go every day. So first of all, you have to work. This is sort of my more hobby and sort of passion, but I still have a regular day job, right?
Hmm.
So you try to line up the days, you want it, the rain and the sun and the temperatures, you want everything to be dialed in. And so there was this 1 month where, I was only going to have one day off. And so I found, we found this perfect day, and I was like, let's go. So my partner and I go, it's raining, but it's sort of, there's still some sun. So, that's, They're more active in the rain because it stimulates them. There's probably more food available, jumping around, and worms and stuff that they like to eat. But we get up there and we spend all day looking for turtles. And the whole time I'm thinking, like, this is the perfect condition. Like, everything's perfect. It's the right month based on our historical. We have 24 years of data. We know which months you can find them the best, but we couldn't find anything. And as I mentioned, there's these sort of cliffs that are up high, but then they sort of roll into valleys, and in the middle there's sort of a stream. And one of the places the animals like to hide are these giant, almost like a fig tree, like these buttress roots. And I shouldn't say it's just one location you could potentially find one. They hang out everywhere. But I saw this tree, and it spoke to me. I was like, there's gonna be a turtle up there. But it's so hard to get up there, and you're actually these beautiful buttress roots. You're holding on to them, sort of climbing up this, several meters up to get to the top of this tree. And then the buttress roots sort of run down each side, and they're so tall that, they're waist high. So you're literally having to climb over the roots of these trees. And I haven't mentioned this yet, but there's another native species here, which is this highly aggressive, venomous pit viper called the habu. And so, as I'm sure you can guess, this animal happened to be where I thought this turtle was. And so I'm climbing over these roots, and I'm barely hanging on because it's raining, it's slippery. And again, also the sun's coming through in like little pockets. So it's raining and sunny, but I thought perfect conditions. Well, I think in the US, people have these in their gardens, but it's like these elephant ear plants. You ever seen these elephant ears?
Yeah.
So those grow everywhere here. The similar plants, not the same, but they grow everywhere. Well, these were kind of growing out in between these roots, and there was something like hitting the back of this leaf, and I was like, oh, it's this frog. It's a frog. Cool. There's also a national monument frog here. So I was like, this must be the frog. So I lift over this leaf, and comes a snake coming right at me, right? And it's at this point, I'm not afraid of snakes, but I was definitely shocked. And so there's a cliff on one side, there's a snake on the other side, and I'm trying to figure out, if I fall, I'm probably gonna have to go to the hospital. And there's no cell phone service for like 30 or 40 minutes where we're at. I mean, we're really isolated. I mean, unless you had a satellite phone.
You're in the sticks.
Yeah, we're out there. So if I fall, I knew I was going to get hurt. I was like, if I fall back, I'm not going to die, but I'm going to get hurt, probably bad. Maybe break something. Definitely break the skin. And the streams are very well known for people getting a small nick, and then they end up being hospitalized for weeks for flesh-eating bacteria. So I knew, I was like, if I fall back, I'm going to hit this rock, and I'm going to have a huge wound, and I'm going to be in a hospital. Like, I don't have the money for this. I'm catching turtles for a living at this point, right? Like, this isn't looking good. I only had one day off to go look for turtles, and now I'm going to be in a hospital for months because of this injury. Or I'm being bit by the snake. And I remember someone saying, if you get bit by the snake, your chance of living is like 50-50. It's not bad. But the type of venom it is, it's better than less than 50-50.
It's still 50-50. That's a coin flip, my man.
I was like, I'm healthy, I can take this, right? But this snake just keeps pushing me back. And so I end up sort of hobbling around and sort of shimmying around the tree trunk until I get all the way back over to the back side of the tree, because the tree was sort of, again, off this cliff, but it kind of forked into another stream. So you can imagine a stream going like this and making a Y, and it was right in the middle of that Y. So most of the sides were cliff. Only the small part of the back actually had land to get to. But I managed to make it out of there alive, and I didn't get bitten. But I was so shocked because I'd seen that snake before, but I'd never, and everyone had said, this is an aggressive snake. I was like, I've lived here for so long, this is nothing. But at that point, we came home. I immediately emailed the top venomologist who had worked with these animals. We had a meeting, and we developed an SOP, bought first aid kits, all sorts of stuff that we should have already had. And we even was trying to work. We were even trying to work with a local university to develop some sort of like anti-venom like pen that like an EpiPen type thing you could use in the field, because it was so like shocking how close that almost happened. I mean, it was just, we decided we shouldn't go out into the forest anymore and go do that type of work. But now it's like, if we see something that could be, it's sort of, every time we go look at something now, we have lights, so we're looking for snakes. Like, we were terrified that we're going to get bit by a snake because we are isolated. So we've got these snakes that can get us. We've got no cell service. We've got mosquitoes that will go crazy on you. We've got, you can fall off a cliff. We got flesh-eating bacteria. There's all these things that are coming at us to just try to save these turtles. And I realized, like, this is actually kind of dangerous doing this work. Like, I'd never thought about this as dangerous, but I was like, I could have really been badly hurt. And it also made me think, like, we shouldn't just take anybody out with us because there's so much risk for, injury and, potentially worse. That's, I'd say, my one wild story related to maybe a snake, less about the turtle. And we still didn't find a turtle, which was also bad. Bad day, right?
The turtle.
All to find a turtle and we couldn't find it. But it was a beautiful
Oh my
tree.
goodness. I think the first thing I would have done is after that experience, I would have gone back, reviewed the grant, and I would have penciled in an additional amount of money for personal salary for hazard pay.
Yeah, we should have a hazard pay something in there. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty wild. Like, people have died from these as well. And that's one of because of this being previously a US territory, there's still a lot of American bases here. And that's one of the top rated cautions for them. Snakes, be careful, watch out. And there's little signs as well, even around Okinawa, be careful, there's a snake. Even my neighbor, when they chop down like limbs and rake up leaves, they take them far away. And I was like, why don't you just leave them here? They're like, because they attract the snakes, the habu. So I'm like, okay, it makes sense.
This wild story hits me very personally. Viewers on YouTube aren't going to be able to see this because I'm wearing a long sleeve shirt, but I have a tattoo sleeve on my right arm, and wrapped around my arm is a viper. And the premise of the entire tattoo sleeve is faith over fear. And the fear is snakes, because I'm like Indiana Jones. I don't like snakes. I'm better with them now than I was growing up. I grew up in Florida. We had water moccasins out there. That's a fucking scary snake. And that's kind of where it started. And so to hear this story, I would have shit myself. I would have just shit myself and be like, well, it's over for me. I'm taking the cliff. Goodbye.
Yeah, it was freaky. I didn't realize how aggressive, and I still don't know why the snake was so aggressive. I'd seen video of people sort of trying to take a picture on the road, and the snake was striking the camera, and they weren't even I would say, that close.
I would have been pissed at the tree. I would have been like, you called me over here to potentially die.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of related to that crazy story. Sort of in that same time frame, I'm trying to sort of raise money and or fund this type of conservation work. So I'm sort of taking different oddball jobs. So I was working with with a separate company, doing some advising, and I had this one client, and it was only for the money. I was not interested. And the main reason was they were very reliable. They would constantly cancel. Like, they would change the schedule, like, constantly. And I mean, it would be like Monday, let's change it to Tuesday, and then Tuesday, let's change it to Thursday. It would go like this for weeks.
Can't relate.
Yeah, it was just super wild. And so it was, again, one of these perfect days. I was like, I have a meeting with this group that I'm advising, but they're so unreliable. And every time in the past that I've wanted to go out and I scheduled that, basically every time there's a good day and I have them, I end up being really angry because they cancel me. So I was like, screw it. I'm going to the forest today. They're going to cancel, whatever. Like, I'm not even that, but I need the money, right, to help the turtles. So we go anyways to the jungle, and sort of I'm hiking, up this mountain, and all of a sudden I get a ding, and I realize, like, wow, what's that? And I look at my phone, and the message was from the client. Oh, I hope we're still on for the meeting in 10 minutes. And oh, by the way, it's very serious. We need video. We have another, basically put all this pressure on me. And I'm like, oh no, I'm in the jungle. And so I literally had to leave my partner, and I like run down this hill again after, I already known about the snake problem now. So I'm like, I need this money. So I have to run down this mountain, get to a car. And again, I could be running into a snake all within 10 minutes. And I had to then get in the car, and I can't be a hypocrite. So I had to go slowly because I don't want to hit a turtle, right? So I'm going really slow, trying to find a signal. I was like, I only need like 2 bars. I'm good to have this meeting. And I hit this one little open area, and it was like a citrus fruit farm. And I was like, oh, this is great. I got 3 bars. So I sit down, and I ended up having to have this meeting out there with the client. And, the first thing is, where are you at? I'm like, I'm just outside. The signal's bad. I realized it's because of the crows. So the crows were eating these citrus fruits. And so they're just squawking at me because I'm like entering into their lunchroom basically. And so they're mad at me. So I'm having to like pause it in between talking, hoping that the crows, I ended up having to like take one of these oranges off the tree and like throw it into the tree to scare off the crows. And, and it's really all to take this client where I can just, get a little extra money for conservation. And I think there has to be other people who do this type of work where you have to try to balance work with conservation, and they're not necessarily the same thing. And that's a unique situation for me because I normally don't work with clients I don't want to work with. I'm fortunate to make that decision, but this is one where I said, I'm going to bite the bullet and take them because I need the money for the turtles.
I can relate. I work a 9 to 5 so I can continue to fund Wildscape and all of our projects that we do. And I have those same moments where there's an opportunity where, I can go record an episode of Wild and Unprotected with someone I really want to record to. Or record with, and I can't do it because I have 10 other meetings about something I do not give two shits about. It makes me feel guilty, a lot of the time because I'm so passionate about this, just like you're passionate about the turtles. And knowing that the only way really to keep it going is to take meetings that you don't want to be in, take jobs that you don't want to be in is such a buzzkill, but it's how it works. You have to be able to keep the lights on to be able to do what you think is right or do, what you're passionate about. So honestly, props to you. I can relate. I hate that I can relate if I'm being honest, but it's part of it.
Yeah, it is. It's something that my partner and I really come to the conclusion. I worked in academic science and then I'd sort of worked in the private sector. And, I'm considering now doing maybe more in the government space because we realize you need stability to do conservation work. Working in a startup, you can make a lot of money, but you can also lose a lot of money really fast. And your schedule is unpredictable. And our sort of takeaway after about 5 years of this is that we need a stable income, and we need to go out and make a lot of money and then spend it on the things that we want to do, like the animals, instead of trying to do what we love and then money will come type idea, right? If you just do what you love, the money will come. And that just never happened in this case. And we were fortunate to meet somebody who is very wealthy, who also loved turtles and has built, one of these great conservation centers in California, not so probably so far from you. And the experience of going there and seeing what he was able to do with his career money and sort of put it into conservation, that's when it really clicked for me. Like, I need to do science because I like science. I'm a scientist, but find a way to make money at it and then do conservation science as my passion. And so just sort of separating the job from the conservation.
Yeah, it really doesn't, I think, for a lot of people. And shout out to Terrence Lee for the next thing that I'm going to say. He is the director for the Red Panda Network on the US based office. And it was actually the first episode of this season. And he said something that I've probably brought up every other episode on this point, or at this point. It's that conservation doesn't happen on an empty stomach. Plain and simple. And, I will echo that sentiment as long as I can. It's why I try my best to enable my team that works, with Wildscape to go do what you have to do to put a roof over your head. This will be here. We're going to continue to work and we're going to try and create good content. We're going to try and be, proper advocates. But, to your point, you have to have some point of stability to be able to do this. And, I hope that goes well for you because let me tell you, it is a tough journey. It's the reason I made a U-turn from becoming a marine biologist because there was no chance I was going to make enough money to live. Being a marine biologist, I think very few do. So in order to really make that impact in conservation that I wanted to, I took the journey that I did. I got my MBA, went into the kind of corporate world, still unfortunately in the corporate world. No offense to the place I'm at now. Blessed with my working situation now that I would even be able to continue to do what I do, with Wildscape in this show. So props to you. If that's the way that it works, I hope it does because I damn sure know that you're going to do what you can to impact and save this species.
Absolutely. I'm an entrepreneur at heart, and I hope to start more companies in the future. But I think for the short term, especially to address these problems with the animals, I can have a bigger impact by giving them more attention. When you probably, as you've noticed, running your own company, it's a 24-hour job, right? 24/7 versus a 9-to-5 job's not so bad because that outside of that 9 to 5, you can do your other project and really focus. Versus, it's sort of like I'm back and forth, whenever there's time, there's turtles. And I feel like I can give them more and help them more with maybe a more stable, sort of maybe more traditional scientist job, it's still a great job, but the being an entrepreneur at the same time is kind of crazy.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. I call it turning off and on the light switch.
Like,
When you're in that full nonprofit, startup, entrepreneurial time frame in life, the light switch is always on. When you have the 9 to 5, you flick it on and off when you need to. And when you flick it off and you're able to really devote your time to what you're passionate about, I feel like the results are better most of the time. Unless, you're lucky the nonprofit entrepreneurial route is fully funded, then you get the best of both worlds because you're getting that 9 to 5 stability and then you're able to devote it to the animal or the species or the cause, but rarely does that ever happen.
yeah, I think it's a unique situation when it happens, and I think that there has to be some government out there that has figured out how to do that, though. I mean, to sort of support that type of entrepreneurial activity, conservation type of work, and so there has to be something they get out of it, whether it's a podcast that attracts a lot of views so they can sell something else.
Yeah.
But there has to be a way to make money, and unfortunately, I haven't cracked the code on this turtle stuff yet, so I'm going to keep going.
Well, given everything that you've shown me and the limited interaction that we've had so far, I would say you'll figure it out. For the listeners out there, normally I don't dive too deep into what is discussed in our discovery call, but I will say one of the things that I was absolutely blown away with and most impressed with was the presentation skills that you have from the jump. I can say you are the first. I think this will be, we're in our mid fees, I think, episode count now. I can confidently say I have never had anyone show up with a PowerPoint before, let alone a PowerPoint that was impressive like yours was. So I have
Great.
zero doubt you are going to get to where you're going at some point.
But some of my skills, PowerPoints.
It was impressive. I got off of our discovery call and I immediately messaged one of our other production teams for another show that we have that I think by the time this releases will be announced. And I said, you guys will never believe what I just saw on a discovery call. And I told them, they're like, my God, that is so fucking cool. You not only impressed me, you impressed a lot of the team members. And I'm really hoping that with this episode, a lot of people are really impressed. And I think that's a really good point for us to talk about people getting involved with what you're doing. How do they help? How do they support? If there was ever a time to put it out there and let people know, now is the time. Because we're going to clip this, we're going to give it to you, and we want you to share it with everyone.
Absolutely. The easiest way, if you have a great idea, if you're passionate about turtles or conservation, some people grew up in Okinawa. There's a lot of Americans who were born here who live and maybe listen to this show. If you want to help the turtles or help nature in Okinawa, please reach out to me directly. You can email me. I can give my email, and then also you can direct message our organization on Instagram. Those are sort of the easiest ways to just maybe open up the conversation. If you are interested to just make a single or donation, we have a online application on our website called Syncables. It's one of these very simple apps where you can just add the amount you want and push donate, and it's a one-time thing. It's very simple. We're always looking for people with unique skills. So if you want to donate your time and help the turtles, again, we talked about how cool they look, right? They can make a cool Pokemon. If you're an artist or a sculptor, please reach out, because we'd love to make a toy or make some cool artwork and put it on a t-shirt to sort of spread the word about these turtles. In addition, if you can think of a way to support conservation by potentially donating to research. I mentioned donations. That donation really would go towards research, not really running the organization, because we don't have a lot of overhead at this point where it's all volunteer work. But if you have a passion for research and funding that type of work, we're doing a lot of cool stuff, and you can really pick what area you would like us to focus your money in, whether it be sort of on the animal side or maybe more on the education side. So that's sort of my pitch to getting involved. It's typically easier just to talk than it is to maybe go on a website, but please visit our website. It's okinawa-kame.org, and you can see our social links and see a little bit about it. It's bilingual, so just make sure you change it to English if that's your native tongue or your preferred language.
Yeah, well, we're hoping we push some people your way because this is definitely one of the cooler species I think we've discussed on the show. It's damn near one of my favorite episodes we've recorded so far. This one was fun.
Great. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a good place to not only wrap this show, but season 2 of Wild and Unprotected. I want to thank Cape Class for sponsoring us. It's been a great time. I hope all the viewers have enjoyed this episode with Zach. Thank you, Zach, for joining us today. We recorded for quite a bit of time, so thank you for sticking through it. And thank you to all the listeners out there. And I think we're done for the season. We'll see you next season, everyone.